guys, welcome back to part 2 of the particle animals tutorial. Here is where we left off in the first part. I've got Cinema open, we've got a particle animation cached out, and a viewport rendering of the sequence playing in the picture viewer. Now, I wasn't too happy with the results from our first cache, so I changed a few things and recached it. Mostly, I found that the particles were living still too long, so I reduced the lifespan of the first emitters, particles, to 15 frames, and the second one to 20 frames. Also, I upped the particle count to 20,000 particles per emitter per frame, just to give me a few more particles. If I scrub the timeline, you can see that I've got around 300,000 particles from the first emitter, and around 400,000 from the second. Also, something I found really weird is that even though we're taking care of the particle radius with our scale modifiers, Octane Render still seems to read the radius value that you define in the group, so make sure you have a particle radius of 1 set for both particle groups. Other than that, I think we're ready to go and get this looking great with Octane Render. Right, the first thing I want to do is clean up my scene a little bit. I'm going to fold the XP system for now. I'm going to create 3 null objects. The first null I'm going to name cameras. The second one I'm going to name lights. And the third one I'm going to call just scene objects, I guess. I'm going to drag the camera under the camera's null, right-click, and create a Cinema4d Octane tag, Octane camera tag. Also, for both the emitters, I want to add a C4d Octane object tag. I'm going to control-click and drag it to the second emitter to create a duplicate. Now, as you might know, Octane does not have a sphere particle rendering preset. But what I like about Octane is that with this workflow, you define your objects that you want to be rendered as particles. And with this setup, we're going to create the variation that we want and have full control over our particle scales. Now, I think it's time to create yet another null. Call it particle geometry. And let's start with a simple sphere. I'm going to hold down the primitive menu and create a sphere from it. Now I'll reduce the radius to 1 centimeter and also reduce the segments to 12. Depending on the particle amount that you've got in your scene, you should try to keep this segments value as low as possible, since every polygon counts when it comes to your GPU. I'm going to change the type to icosahedron. I'm going to make it a child of the particle geometry. I'm probably even rename this to particle geometry A. Now let's start by creating some materials. I'll open up the material manager, and in my Octane tab, I'm going to open the Octane dialog. Under materials, I want to create a new universal material. I'll rename it to XPA and assign it to a sphere. Now I have got a limited screen space here, so I won't use my regular Octane layout. I'll just come to the materials section and open up the node editor. Now in here, we've got a regular white universal material. But in order to get the particle color, we can use an instance color node with the source set to particle and simply drag the emitter A into the color source. Now display color is fine. So Octane will automatically read those color values from the particles. You can always use a color correction node after you import the particle color to further influence the look of your particles. I'm going to feed that color channel into the albedo and also in the transmission channel. I'm going to leave everything default. Close the node editor. And I want to create a simple area light. Now, since I've got my filter preset animation on, I don't see the lights anymore. I can simply reactivate them by clicking the light in the filter section. Now I've got the light back. I want to jump out of my camera, bring up the light, and rotate it down 90 degrees so I've got a nice overhead area light there. So jump back into a camera and click the cogwheel to open up the Octane render settings. Now I want to choose the path tracing kernel, but reduce the samples quite a bit. Let's try 512 for now. Also, the diffuse and specular depths are way too high for this scene, so I'm going to reduce them both to 8. I'm going to leave everything else default in the kernel section, but head over to the settings tab and jump to color management. Here I've got the OCIO config automatically loaded. You don't have to work with ACES, obviously, but I highly recommend Silverwing's and also Grayscale Gorilla's tutorial on the ACES Octane render workflow. So you definitely get better, more beautiful results using ACES. Also make sure in the camera imager tab under OCIO, you've got ACES sRGB as a view preset. Now, something that I forgot to mention while recording this tutorial is, once you set up ACES in your Octane settings, make sure to change the Octane Live Viewer display to OCIO sRGB in order to get the correct color display. All right, I think what we should do now is deactivate our second emitter, head to the Object tab, and under Particle Rendering, just drag and drop the sphere. Let's jump to one of the early frames where we don't have as many particles, just to get quicker feedback, and open up the Live Viewer. And everything seems to be working just fine. We've got a white background, which is Octane's default environment, which you can change under Settings, Environment. I'll put this to black usually. We can see that everything's working. We've got the nice light from above, and also we've got shiny, pretty big spheres. Now, like I said before, in the particle rendering section of the object tag, you can define the different objects you want to be rendered on the particles. Now let's say this sphere has a value of 1 in the radius section. So I'm going to call this sphere large. I'm going to create a duplicate, call it medium, and reduce the size to 0.5. Now if I add this second sphere into the particle rendering list, you should see 2 different sizes appearing. Let's for now create a second camera. I call this close. I'll just up the focal length so we are more zoomed in on our scene. So you can see more clearly that we now got 2 different sizes. Now this is obviously completely up to you. What I find myself doing mostly is create more small particles. Let's give them a radius of, let's say, 2 point. 5. Create 3 of those. And also add them to the object list. You can always click the lock icon, so this window gets locked. Deselect, select all of your small spheres, and just put them in there. Make sure to click the lock icon again to see what's going on. I'm going to scrub the timeline a little bit just to get a different framework in here. Now, for my taste, the big particles are still too many. So what I can do is further work on the distribution of my particles. I'm going to create another medium sphere by control-clicking and dragging. And also another small one. And for the last 2 small ones, I'm going to up the radius to 0.3. And for the very first one, I'm going to reduce it to 0.2. Of course, make sure you add them to the list. Now, you can always hit this little icon in the object list to activate and deactivate the objects to get a better feel of the distribution. But for now, I'm quite happy with that. Now, unfortunately, you cannot simply copy the same particles for the second emitter, since, as you remember, we linked that XP emitter A to the source. So what I usually do is create a copy of the Octane material, rename it to B, duplicate the whole particle geometry folder, rename this also to B, select all the materials that are still XPA, and drag the XPB material into that material slot. Now, all that's left to do is deactivate the first emitter, jump to the second emitter's object tag, lock it, select all the B particles, put them in the list, set the mode to geometry, unlock it, go to the B material, open up the node editor once again, and also relink the instance color. Now, sometimes Octane doesn't update, so make sure you're working on the second X particles material. Now, find the instance node and relink emitter B. If I now enable the second emitter, I should see it working. And yeah, there it is. Let's use the close-up camera once again to combine and see if there's actually, there's even more size variation now because we set the second scale modifier to 0.5, whereas the first one was set to 1. All right, that's working nicely. And I think this is something we could already go for the final render when it comes to the particle size. Now, let's clean this up a little bit. And I don't know if you've noticed, but for some reason, Octane renders the particle geo. Even though it's assigned to the particles, it still renders it. And since they're sitting at the origin, they are both rendered here, or all of them are rendered here. What I usually do is I select both the groups and just put a gigantic number in one of the parameter fields, just to move it out of the scene completely. Now, next up, I want to create an HDR environment and also a color environment. And you'll see why in a second. Let's close the Material Manager for now. Put the overhead light in the Lights tab, in the Lights node, and create 2 HDR environments. The first one I'm going to rename to HDR, create a copy by clicking Control and dragging, and the second one to visible. We're not going to render with the visible background on, but it still leaves a bit of color on the particles. Now the visible Octane environment object, I'm going to set to visible environment. And the second one, I want to load in HDR. Now this is obviously completely up to you. I'll just pick a random HDR here. Now if I deactivate my light, I can see only the influence of the HDR, which for some reason makes it really yellow. I'm just going to pick another one. I want to use this HDR mostly just to fill in some light. I think that's fine for now. Let's bring back the overhead light and zoom in once again. Now the default value of the specular roughness is set to 0. This is why they're pretty shiny right now. I want to change that. So I go to the XP material A, open up the node editor, and in the roughness channel, I'm going to set a value of around 2.2, which gives it a nicer, rougher reflection. Let's try 0.3. I mean, these are artistic choices that you can obviously make for yourselves. For the second one also. Now, when it comes to the particle resolution, the sphere's resolution, you might want to use a lower segment count for cameras that are far away from your object, and up the resolution when you're close up. I mean, here you can clearly see the faceting. You could either do this with takes, or just depending on your camera angle, but keep in mind that you might see those faceted spheres in close-up perspectives. Now, since we're only using the overhead light, which obviously you can adjust in the light's parameters tab, I want to fill in some more light towards the bottom particles, the feed particles. And I usually find myself just creating a plane. Let me move this out of the way. And put it underneath my object. Create a new Octane diffuse material and put that on the plane. I'll name this reflector, even though this might not be the correct term, but you'll see the difference in a second. Let's right-click in the live viewer and show in picture view. So we've got a snapshot of our current setup. Let's now activate the live viewer again and see if this makes a difference, and it totally does. So you can see already that this is totally different from what we had before. So we're using this plane to just bounce back some light at the bottom. Now obviously this is way too much, so back to the node editor. On the reflector material, you can just dial in a grayscale value in the diffuse color channel. So if you set this to 0, you're back with the no bounce light, and then you can up it. And obviously you can even put in some color if you want. For example, you could make those bounce lights a slightly bluish color. I'll leave that up to you. I'm gonna put the color back to black and just work with the float number, which works as soon as there's no information in the color channel. I think we're ready to render now. I'll just clean up the scene a little bit, put the reflector plane and the particle geo on the scene objects, put my HDR and visible environments on the lights. The only other thing I want to change is work a bit on the size of my area light. I mean, obviously you can add more lights and play around with different temperatures, getting more complex lighting working, but I think this is fine for the sake of this tutorial. Let's check a few more frames. Yeah, I'm quite happy with that. Also, it renders pretty quickly, and I'm on a laptop with only one 3080. Now let's close the live viewer, hit Ctrl-B to open the render settings, right-click and say New. I'll call this Octane and change the render to Octane Render. I'll uncheck Save, go to the Output tab, and say all frames at 720p, which is fine for this tutorial. I'll go to the Octane Render tab and change the color space to OCIO and OCIO ACES ZG. If you're working with the denoiser option in the camera tag, make sure to use the denoise beauty pass. Head over to the render AOV group and enable that in here. I'm gonna pick the folder I want to save this in. I usually create a C4D out folder within my cinema file folder. I'll create another folder, call it sequence 01, and the file I'm going to name $PRG for project _ $camera _. Now these tokens are automatically going to name your files. $PRG is the project name, and $camera is the current camera name, which, by the way, I should probably change to cam side. I'm going to check Save Beauty just to make sure. Yeah, I think we're ready to hit render. So I'm going to save the scene and hit Shift and R to render the sequence, and I'll be back once that's done. All right. The render is finished. It took around 45 minutes to render 300 frames at 720p. Now let's head into After Effects and import this sequence. Double-click in the Project tab to bring in the importer. Select the first frame, make sure to have OpenEXR sequence checked, and import it. Now it defaults to 25 FPS on my computer, so I'm going to interpret footage, main, and change it to 30. Drag it onto the new comb icon to create a new composition, only to find that it renders black. Now we need to extract the beauty path from it. So come over to Effects and Presets and hit Extractor to bring in the Extractor plugin. Select the beauty path, and now you should have your particles and the alpha channel. Now, in order to get ACES working in After Effects, you need to have the plugin installed. I'll put in the link in the description for that as well. Make sure you are working at 32 bits per channel. The working space is set to sRGB, and you linearize the working space. Create a new adjustment layer by right-clicking, say New Adjustment Layer. Let's rename it to ACES. And look for the Open Color IO plugin. Double-click, and in the configuration, just head to your Open Color IO config file. Once you got that loaded, set the input space to ACES CG and the output space to output sRGB. This already does transformation, however, it's not entirely correct. And again, thanks to Silverwing and his tutorial on how to set that up. I also put a link in the description. You need a second effect that's called Color Profile Converter. double click to add it, set the input profile to sRGB, also the output profile to sRGB, but make sure to linearize the output profile. Now, what you see in After Effects should match what you've seen in the Octane Live viewer. Now, in between the EXR sequence and this ACES conversion, I want to do my color correction. So I'm gonna, again, right-click, say New Adjustment Layer, call it CC for color correction, and I want to add an exposure effect. Here, I can bring up the exposure a bit and also control the gamma a bit, just to brighten it up a little bit. After that, I want to change the hue a bit, so I type in hue saturation and just bring this into the negative area. Also, I want to boost up the saturation just a little bit. All right, all that's left to do is create yet another adjustment layer, call it LUT, and look for the Apply LUT effect. Now, I've used the AVA 614 LUT that ships with Octane, but I reduced it to 50%. Now you still got the transparent background working here, so what I want to do is take that composition, drag it onto the new comp icon to bring it into the next composition, where I can then right-click, New, Solid, name this BG, and just put it behind. I like using the fill effect to interactively change the color. And yeah, there you have it. This is a bit simplified version of what I did for my animations. The only thing other thing I would add in After Effects would be motion blur, just to make it a bit more easy on the eye. I use a really smart motion blur, but since it's a third-party plugin, I'm not going to include it in the tutorial. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something new. Please let me know what you think. Use the comment section, and I'll see you soon. Bye.